Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel, I'm a low stakes specialist who's been a pro for over a decade and a half. If you're looking to learn how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. I have an extremely high win rate in hourly, and I'm more than happy to impart some of my knowledge. On the weekends, I can often be found playing on a live stream on the Absolute Nuts YouTube channel, hosted at the Resorts World in Las Vegas, so you're more than welcome to come watch me play live. I'm the weirdo with the mask. I wish I could say I'm the weirdo with the beardo because that sounds a whole lot cooler, but unfortunately, as an Asian man, I can't seem to grow more than like 3 hairs on my chinny chin. I currently have a 100k challenge this year. I want to see how long it takes me to make 100k in 2025 playing only 2-5 and occasionally 5-5 no limit hold'em. Keep in mind I only average about 15 hours a week playing poker. That's like less hours than a part-time job. Certainly there's no freaking way such a goal is achievable, right? I mean, regular poker crushers only win 8 to 10 big blinds per hour, right? Anyways, let's jump to my most recent session I played this Sunday evening and see how things are going so far with my 100k challenge. As usual, we're playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 1500, which is 300 big blinds. We start the session at 10:34 at night. 10 minutes into the session, there's a live 10. I open to 30 in the cutoff with pocket 7s, which is a perfectly reasonable amount when you're deep stack. Small blind calls, but the big blind 3 bets to an alarming $150 with a full stack of 1500. This raise is a bit on the larger side, but he is admittedly out of position, so it is possible he could have an actual overpair here. We're deep enough to set mine, so I make the call, but the small blind gets out of the way. We go heads up in position to a flop of 3, 10, 5, rainbow. Our opponent doesn't slow down and c-bets for a pretty large sum of another 150. I consider folding right here and now. This board isn't conducive to his 3-bet range, however, so he's either c-betting with complete air or he has an actual overpair here. And with this bet sizing, he's trying to represent the latter. I figure I can call one time to see what he does on the turn. If I feel the heat for more aggression on the turn, it's just going to be an easy fold. So the turn comes and it brings in a jack of clubs, putting another overcard on board, but one that isn't likely to be in my opponent's range. He slows down and checks. I contemplate my options. I can check the action back and realize my equity, or I can bet here and try to get a hand like ace-king or ace-queen to fold. If our opponent really does only have a hand like ace-king or ace-queen, he realistically only has 10 outs to hit something by the river, which is only about 23%. So my other option is to just check the action back. We can let our opponent have a free card here and just hero call a river bet as long as the board doesn't change. This is, of course, assuming that we think our opponent is bluffing. There's still the very real likelihood that our opponent has an actual overpair here and is just playing cautiously. I was fully planning to fold to aggression on the turn, but a check starts to make me salivate. This board isn't particularly great for a hand like kings or queens. We could feasibly have 10s or jacks here. We're ahead of ace-king and ace-queen, and maybe we can even get a super tight player to lay down an overpair with a substantial bet. I decide to get a little reckless and throw out a bet of 300. Our opponent thinks about his options for a little while before making the call. Okay, at this point I definitely think we're behind. The river breaks out with the deuce of diamonds. Our opponent checks again. I take inventory of our stacks and notice we only have about 850 behind. That's less than a pot-sized bet. I think checking back on the turn would have been a much better play. I'd have a lot more ammunition to bluff on this river if I'm so inclined. As it stands, I don't think most players would be willing to fold to an 850 bet into a pot of over $1,200. Realistically though, if I ever do jam on this river, I'll absolutely have an overpair beat the vast majority of the time. I just think that too many opponents will call in this spot, and I don't want to be stuck for a full 300 big blinds only 10 minutes into the session, so I decide to check the action back. Our opponent flips over pocket queens. So now we're stuck $650 right through the gate. Oh man, this guy sucks. I thought he was going to teach me how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, not how to lose $650 with a tiny pocket pair that's even smaller than his little peepee. Well gee, man, gosh, I'm only just warming up. Give me a few minutes to take off my coat at least. Less than 10 minutes later, under the gun limps. The middle position raises to 10 with a $500 stack. The low jack and cutoff both call. I look down at ace 10 of clubs in the small blind. Usually tiny raises like the one the middle position made denote some kind of small pocket pair, like deuces through sevens or some such. So I figure I'd give him a bad price to set mine. I should also be able to outplay any small pair post-flop in the event that he does call. So I 3-bet the action up to $75. The under-the-gun limper suddenly cold calls with an $1,800 stack, and the middle position original raiser calls as well, but the other two players fold. So we go 3 ways to a flop of ace, 8, 9, with 2 hearts and 1 spade. That's a pretty darn welcome flop. Out of position, I decide to start with a check to see how my opponents would like to proceed. Thankfully, they both check the action back, so we know we're pretty darn good. See guys, when you play in a deep stack game, just because an early position raiser checks the flop, that doesn't mean they don't have a strong hand. Don't try to outplay me here on an ace-high board, thinking you can get a hand like kings or queens to fold. I didn't check because I'm weak, I just checked to get information on what sorts of hands my opponents could be holding. I don't exactly want to butt heads for stacks against the under-the-gun player who has my stack covered, but I wouldn't mind colliding with the middle position original raiser who has less than 400 left behind. Okay, so the turn comes, and it's a 5 of hearts, completing the front door flush. This is not the best card for me. It's feasible that one of my opponents could have a hand like pocket 5s here, but I figure it's about time we found out. I wouldn't want a random heart to roll off on the river, and then one of my opponents ends up winning with a hand like pocket 3s with 3 of hearts or something like that. So I shoot out a tentative bet of 100 into the pot of 240. If someone turned a set of 5s here, or maybe if they slow played a set on the flop, we're definitely going to hear about it right about now. So here, under the gun calls, but the middle position folds. We feel pretty darn confident about our hand right about now. So the river comes, and it's a 7 of clubs. A 6 makes a 1 card straight. I do the rational thing and check. Under the gun thinks his hand is worth betting all of a sudden, and throws out a decently strong bet of 250. I snap call. I mean, if he somehow has a 6 in his range, I'm just gonna pay him off. I think it's much more likely that he has a missed flush draw. So he flips over his hand, and he shows deuce 5 offsuit with no hearts. And I'm like, what? Bro just cold called a 3-bet to 75 with deuce 5 offsuit. Alert! Alert! Action player detected!
I've got you in my sights.
About 10 minutes later, the under the gun and middle position limp. Small blind completes. I check back my option in the big blind with jack 8 of clubs. The flop comes 4, queen 9, rainbow with 1 club. We flop a gut shot draw with a backdoor flush draw. I don't mind this flop at all. I'm a pretty big fan actually. If a 10 comes, we'll make a straight. And it's very unlikely that one of our opponents limped with a hand as strong as king jack. So I start with a check. Under the gun checks as well. The middle position suddenly comes out firing a massive bet of $50. The small blind folds, of course. This is the same opponent from the last hand, whom we've put on our radar as an action player, a wild card, a donator, an El Pollo Loco, or whatever you want to call him. He's sitting there with over $1,500 still. With the naked gut shot, we'd only have a 1 in 11 chance of spiking our much-needed 10 with this next card. So we would need to win a pot of over $550 to make this call worthwhile. With our backdoor flush draw, however, our odds increase from only 4 outs to effectively 5, since every backdoor draw gives you the equivalent of about 1 out. Our opponent is really deep, and he's already proven himself to be the sort of player who doesn't like folding. So I actually make this outlandish call by sticking in $50 into the $20 pot with my gut shot draw. See, this is the difference between deep stack play and your typical 100 big blind game. In a normal 100 big blind game, I'm almost never going to get the right odds to make the call here. So I stick my money in, and the under the gun player folds. So in my head, I'm thinking of one specific card. If you could think of any card in the whole deck, what card would you want to come off on the turn? Yes, I'd love to see a 10, but to be more specific, I'd really like to see a 10 of clubs. So the turn comes, and my eyeballs just about bounce out of their sockets. It's a freaking 10 of clubs. Not only do we make the second nuts, but we have a straight flush redraw if we need it for whatever reason. So of course, I do the rational thing and check. Our opponent doesn't slow down and shoots out yet another massive overbet of 150 into the pot of 120. See, this is why I call it the flop. Our opponent isn't playing standard poker. I really hope he has a massive hand like 2 pairs or something. Against a player like this, I'm not even going to bother pondering over what sort of two-pair combinations he might have here. It could be as irrational as 9-4 offsuit for all I know. I contemplate what to do. I could slow play here, but I really want to get all the money in by the river. If our opponent overplays his hand, we might be able to get it all in right here and now. I'm definitely going to raise, but the only question is, how much? I don't want to get too greedy and get a fold out of him since we're pretty freaking nutted. But then again, I think the fold button might be missing from his play screen. So I decide to stick in the check raise to the tune of $4.50. I'm really hoping for an all-in shove, but I think our opponent will have zero folds here for this price point. Well, he doesn't go all in, but he does make the call. The river comes, and it's a 4 of spades, pairing bottom pair. Not particularly happy with this card, since some weird two-pair combinations containing a 4 is very much in our opponent's range, but I'm still calling a shove if that's what he decides to do. Remember the last hand where we checked the river and our opponent tried to stab with a $250 bet? Well, maybe that trick will work again. I check. Unfortunately, our opponent checks the action back. We table our hand, and he flips over King 9 of clubs. Oh, phew! If the river had been another club, we were definitely doubling him up. We actually had more outs than we thought. A jack on the turn would have been sufficient enough to win as well. We didn't get the river stab we were hoping for, but I'm still really happy to reel in a $500 win here. With this win, we're not even half an hour into the session, but we've already recovered most of our losses from that first regrettable hand. Only 2 hands later, the hijack opens to 15. I call on the button with ace 8 of diamonds. The small blind folds, but the big blind action player calls as well. The flop comes. Ace, queen, 6, all spades. Not the best flop, but we feel pretty darn confident when both players check the action over to us. I start with a $25 bet. Big blind calls, but the hijack folds, which is the ideal outcome we were hoping for. The turn brings in a 6 of diamonds. Unfortunately, this is not the best card. We now chop with all the weaker aces, but when our opponent checks again, I put him on a flush draw and go for some thick value, shooting out another strong bet of 75. He calls again, because, he quite literally doesn't have a fold button. The river brings in an inconsequential 3 of diamonds. Our opponent checks for a third time. We chop with the vast majority of aces. We beat a queen, but a queen doesn't make a whole lot of sense for him to have here. A missed flush draw isn't going to pay us anything, so I just check the action back. Our opponent flips over queen 5 offsuit for a missed 5 high flush draw. And again, I'm like, I guess I really should have bet the river. This highly unusual player might actually have paid me with a queen here. Okay, note taken. Just go for value at every possible opportunity against this guy. Less than 10 minutes later, the middle position and low jack limp. Small blind folds. I check my option in the big blind with this garbage 5-9 offsuit. The flop comes, and it's 6-4-7 with 2 spades and 1 club. This is actually a really good flop. We're open-ended with 1 overcard, but more importantly, if an 8 hits the turn, we hold the trap card to make a higher straight. So I start with a tiny $5 pot builder. Both opponents call. The turn is the exact card we were hoping for. It's an 8 of hearts, completing our open-ended draw, but more importantly, springing our trap for a disguised second nut straight. I have a couple of options here. I can either go for a check raise, or I can shoot out a disproportionate bet and hope someone with a naked 5 shoves on top of me anyways. So I decide to go for option 2 and throw out a $50 bet into the pot of $30. The middle position folds, but the low jack calls my overbet. I think he has a 5, drawing dead here, but he could still have the flush draw. The river brings in a 4 of spades, which is just about as ugly as it gets. Not only does the board pair, but the front door flush draw gets there as well. Our opponent only has $250 behind. So here I check. If he shoves, unfortunately, I'm just gonna fold. He called my pretty big overbet on the turn. If he shoves here, I can't think of a single hand that I feasibly beat. Thankfully, he does not shove. He throws out a very tiny bet of $45. For that price, we easily make the call, and our opponent flips over 5-7 of diamonds for the smaller straight we were hoping he had. I don't understand the point of his river bet. I mean, what hand could we possibly call here that he has beat? Regardless, thankful for the extra $45, We move on. Okay, time for a brief intermission. One of my coaching students was in town for a tournament, visiting from the East Coast, and this is what she had to say about me. Hi, so we are here with Buffy. And where are you from, Buffy?
I'm from Pensacola, Florida.
So you've taken coaching lessons from me, correct?
Yes.
What do you think about how I coach?
I mean, first time I saw your vlog, I was like, this is the best one out there. For low stakes, as far as vlogging is concerned. For education, too. A lot of them are just entertainment, but you're definitely more of education and learning. And I was just like, definitely followed, watched everything you had, and just couldn't wait for more content to come out. And then I saw that you coached, and I jumped on board right away.
What do you think about my coaching methods as opposed to the difference with my vlogs? Are they about on the same?
Your coaching, no, is much more in-depth. You get better analysis because when I'm telling you exactly what I'm doing, it's like you already know what the hand is. You already know what I'm going to say. So that in itself is it's gold.
All right, thank you so much, Buffy.
Thank you.
A full 45 minutes passes before we play this next hand. There's a live 10. The action folds around to me in the small blind, where I bump the action up to 50 with ace-queen of hearts. The big blind and straddle both call. The flop comes 6-6-king with 2 hearts and 1 diamond. We flop the nut flush draw with 1 overcard to the board. This is a pretty polarizing board. I might be able to take this pot down with a small c-bet, so that's what I decide to do, throwing out another stagnant bet of 50. The big blind folds, but the straddle raises me to 150 with a full $1,500 stack. Okay, not ideal. Against this sort of action, even if an ace hits the turn, we may or may not be good. I'm not ready to fold just quite yet though, so I put in the extra $100 for a call. The turn comes and it's an 8 of clubs, which does nothing for us. So of course I do the rational thing and check. Our opponent throws out another spine-chilling bet of $280 into the $450 pot. I'm not a big fan of calling with draws on a paired board. If our opponent has a 6 here, we'd only have 7 clean outs. An 8 of hearts on the river would just be insult to injury. But even more dangerous, the river could put out a heart that bolts up our opponent. We have no idea if our opponent only has a king here or a 6, and it's not like we have an actual made hand. So after a little bit of contemplation, I make the fold. Barely 5 minutes later, there's a live 10 again. I open to 50 in the low jack with ace-king of spades. Only the straddle calls. So we go heads up, in position, to flop of queen, 2, king, rainbow with 1 spade. Our opponent checks. This is a great flop. Aside from pocket deuces or king-queen, we're not afraid of a whole lot. If our opponent does have one of the aforementioned hands, we're about to find out real soon. I start with a down bet to 40, which is less than a 40% pot bet. He quickly makes the call, so we know we're currently good. The turn comes, and it's an 8 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. Our opponent checks again. Okay, time to go for some thick value. I throw out a much more considerable bet of 150, which is now an 80% pot bet. Once again, our opponent makes the call. The most likely hands he can have here at this point is either a dominated king with a hand like king 10 or king jack, or an open-ended draw while holding a hand like 10 jack, either with or without diamonds. So the river comes and it's incredibly clean 3 of clubs. The only hand we're realistically losing to now is either queen 3 of diamonds or king 3 of diamonds. And I'm not sure either of those hands would call out of position for the $50 price tag we gave pre-flop. So when our opponent checks for a 3rd time, I attempt to reel in the marlin by throwing out a slight overbet to the tune of $500. If our opponent missed his draw, he's not calling anything here. So I'm primarily targeting his king X hands. Our opponent doesn't immediately snap fold, which is always a good sign when you're trying to squeeze out some value. In fact, he tanks for almost a full minute. We're really hoping for a call here. Unfortunately, he does eventually come to the right conclusion as he flicks in his cards for a fold. For this next hand, again, there's another live 10. The action folds around to me in the small blind, where I look down at pocket queens, the luscious ladies. I'm up against the same 2 opponents from earlier where I had the ace-queen of hearts, so against these 2, I don't expect any folds pre-flop. So instead of opening for 50 here, I decide to go for 60 instead. Right on cue, both opponents call. The flop comes 7, 10, 9 with 1 diamond and 2 hearts. This is actually a really bad flop. It's very possible for one of my opponents to have flopped 2 pairs here. A set, a combo draw that's not too far behind us mathematically, or even a combo draw that's ahead of us, like a flush draw that contains an 8. Since I'm out of position, I start with a check. Recreational players telegraph a lot with their bet sizing. So here the big blind checks behind, but the straddler throws out a bet of $80. On this type of board, against a recreational player, they're typically not going to use a half pot bet sizing with a really big hand. The board is horrendously wet, or dynamic, whichever description you'd prefer. So knowing this, I feel pretty confident with our hand. I put in the good old-fashioned check raise to 300. Big blind folds immediately, and the straddler doesn't think too long before folding as well. Notice how I didn't just start with a half pot c-bet or something. If I had done that, we'd have no idea which cards we would need to evade on the turn or river. Some of the time, our opponent could just be trapping us with a flop set or straight as well. By checking, I was able to gain a lot of information about where I stood in the hand. If we had just come out betting, our opponent might call us with a 10 for top pair, a 9 if they didn't believe us, a random 8 for an open-ended straight, some sort of combo draw like 7-8, the flush draw, or even a different kind of open-ended draw like Jack-Queen. We would have no idea, so we'd basically be playing in the dark. With the way that I played it, I went for more of a two-street approach. If our opponent calls our check raise, we'll know he most likely has a draw of some sort, and as long as the turn is clean, we can go for an all-in overshove. It's much easier to get 1 clean out with all the potential draws out there than hope for 2. 20 minutes later, I get into this hand, and fair warning, it's gonna get a bit spicy. The middle position opens to 15 with a 2K stack. I look down at King 7 of clubs in the cutoff, which is a hand I wouldn't normally even limp with here. But here, I'm gonna call it for 3x raise. This is for a couple of different reasons. 1, I have position to the original raiser. And 2, with El Pollo Loco still on the table, any hand that you make will get paid off much bigger than normal if he's involved in the hand. So I make the call. And the button, small blind, and big blind all call as well. We go 5 ways to flop of king, 9, 6, rainbow. We flop top pair with the backdoor flush draw and a kicker that's nothing to write home about. Small blind, big blind, and the middle original raiser all check. With only 1 player yet to act, I think there's a good chance we actually have the best hand right now. So I start with a roughly half pot bet of 40. The action folds around to the middle position, who suddenly thinks his hand is worth 150. Ha! A check raise! Oldest trick in the book. This is just an easy fold. ... Or well, it would be if I were a normal player, but to me, this smells like...
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
So I make the call pretty quickly. I'm smelling a whole lot of horse shite, and for once, it's not coming from me. Think about it. The flop is incredibly disconnected and rainbow. What kind of hand is my opponent really trying to rep here? A set? 2 pairs? What 2-pair combinations make sense on a board like this? And if he had a set, there'd be no reason to raise so big. He'd wait until the turn at least, especially with everyone else already folding. This is just going to be horse manure most of the time here. So we go to a turn, which is an 8 of diamonds. We now turn an open-ended straight draw to go along with our top pair, although truth be told, I don't think we really need to improve. Our opponent comes out betting for 235. If this sounds scary to you, it shouldn't. The check raise to 150 is actually a much bigger raise in proportion to the pot than this measly 235 bet. If anything, this 235 bet actually shows quite a bit of weakness. Maybe our opponent has a bit of showdown value with a hand like 7-8. In any case, this is just a really easy call here. No need to get fancy. Our hand is too weak to raise, and we want to keep in all of our opponent's bluffs as well. So the river comes, and it's a jack of spades. The pot is now just over $800. For reference, if our opponent makes any sort of pot-sized bet here, I'm snap calling. Only an all-in shove here would give me pause to reevaluate my thought process to make sure I didn't miss anything. Instead, our opponent checks. I guess he's given up. No reason to bet against someone pulling shenanigans, so I just check the action back, declaring that I think I have the winner here. He flips over Jack Queen of Hearts. so we take down a pretty sizable pot. Take note that I didn't have a very big hand here. I didn't get lucky and hit a straight, a flush, or even flop a set. No, I just used logic to properly deduce that our opponent was full of air. I don't get any playable hands for over a full hour later. A couple of older Asian ladies sit down in seats 1 and 2 before the start of this hand. Here I open to 20 in the low jack with ace jack of spades, which is a pretty decent hand if you ask me. The hijack and cutoff both call, so we go 3 ways out of position to a flop of king, 3, ace, rainbow. Okay, I want you to pay very close attention to how I play this hand. We flop top pair with a very good kicker. On this flop, I lead with a considerable bet of $40. The hijack calls. Before the low jack, min raises to 80 with an $1,100 stack. Nothing to think about here. This is just a standard easy call. Ha ha! Tricked you again. I fold, but I'm going to let you see the rest of the action to see if you can figure out why I folded. So for $40 more, the hijack isn't going anywhere. He makes the call with 800 behind. The turn is a 5 of spades, keeping the board perfectly rainbow. The hijack checks. Suddenly, the cutoff shoves her entire freaking stack in for an absolutely massive overbet jam. Like, that bet is just nonsensical. I really wish the hijack had snapped her off with a hand like deuce 4 for the turn wheel, considering he's still the same action player from before. Okay, so now for my assessment. I think the cutoff either had a hand like ace 3 or pocket 3s. Her shove on the turn is just ridiculous because she's only getting called by a better hand. That aside, yes, I very much folded to a min raise on the flop. There's an important lesson to be learned here. Your actions should always be geared towards who your opponent is. Against an older Asian lady, I'm almost definitely going to be beat on that flop. And when I'm beat, I'd rather have a hand like a gut shot draw with 10 jack suited or something similar than top pair and a good kicker. At least with a gut shot draw, I'd be drawing to the nuts, as opposed to a hand like ace jack, where even hitting a jack might not be any good. And if I did have a gut shot draw, our opponent would have given away her entire massive stack just to try to earn an extra $40 from us, which we would have gladly taken if we had actually hit. So try to remember the way that I played this hand versus the way that my opponent played this hand as an example of what to do versus what not to do. 20 minutes later, I wake up with this tiny pair, and the middle position opens to 15. Oh, and by tiny, I mean pocket ones. So of course, not to miss an opportunity, I 3-bet the action up to 60 in the low jack. The hijack, our good old friend the crazy chicken, cold calls, but his stack has since diminished down to a measly $500. The middle position tags along as well. 3 ways to a flop, which comes 10, 2, 10, rainbow. The middle position checks. Paired boards in the middling range like 10s, jacks, etc. aren't so great when you have a massive overpair, because one, if not both, of your opponents could easily have flop trips here. This is an incredibly polarizing board. In most scenarios, someone is only drawing to 2 outs here. So I exercise a bit of caution and pot control by checking as well. The hijack, our friend the action player, leads for 45. The middle position folds, which I'm happy to see. The hijack didn't start with a very deep stack, so if he wakes up with a random 10 here, I'm just going to pay him off. I put in the call, with intentions of calling him down every street if he's so inclined to bet. So the turn brings in a jack of clubs. I check, but interestingly enough, he checks the action back. Okay, so at least we know we're good. The river brings in an inconsequential 5 of spades. We know our opponent doesn't like to fold, so I try to squeeze in a little bit of value with a bet of 125. Unfortunately, he does make the fold, but at least we didn't get cracked. Right after this hand, the action player loses his remaining chips, so I figure it's as good a time as any to rack up and leave. In for 2,000 and out for 3,107 for a profit of $1,107 after 3 hours and 44 minutes of playtime. I wasn't a very big fan of the way I played that first hand with the pocket 7s. I think I should have just checked back on the turn, but that aside, I'm glad I was able to recover from my initial loss and turn things around for a nice profit. I'm particularly proud of the way I played King 7 of clubs. as well as my laydown with the ace-jack of spades to a tiny min raise. I think there's a lot of educational value to this session. As to how I'm doing so far in the 100k challenge, well, as of January 12th, this is what we're looking at. I'm up just shy of $5,000 with a $128 average so far. This is taking into account that I had a pretty huge $2,700 loss on the Absolute Nuts channel this past weekend. So if you like what you saw today, please hit that like button. Then subscribe to the channel for more tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em. Check out our Patreon if you want to watch more of the coaching series. And of course, feel free to hit me up on Instagram or through email to inquire about my coaching services. Until next time, I hope to see you in the next video.